Let's talk about the layers of the heart wall. The epicardium, as we know, is another name for the visceral pericardium. It is going to be made up of mesothelium and an underlying layer of loose areolar connective tissue. That loose areolar connective tissue is going to attach directly to the myocardium. If you remember, the suffix myo means muscle, and myocardium means cardiac muscle. So what a surprise, the myocardium is going to be mainly cardiac muscle cells. It will form the bulk of the heart. The endocardium is going to line the chambers of the heart. It is epithelial tissue. It is going to be continuous and contiguous with the endothelial linings of the blood vessels, which bring blood in and out of the heart. And I want you to think about why that's important. 2 reasons. And if you can't figure it out, we'll go over it in class. So remind me if you can't figure it out. Now, the myocardium, that's where the action is. That is what the heart is known for. We know that it's mostly cardiac muscle cells. In fact, 99% of the myocardium is going to be cardiac muscles. There will be a lot of blood vessels and a lot of nerves that are going to support those cardiac muscle cells. There are concentric layers of cardiac muscle tissue. The atrial myocardium is formed of muscle bundles that actually wrap around the atria and are going to form figure eights that circle the great vessels, and there's a good image of that later in this section. The ventricular myocardium has 2 layers. There's going to be superficial ventricular muscles which wrap around both ventricles. And then there's going to be a deeper muscle layer that's going to wrap around the ventricles sort of in a figure 8 pattern. And those figure 8 patterns are going to help when you need to move blood out of the chambers when the heart is contracting. Let's talk a little bit about cardiac muscle cells as a refresher. We know they are relatively small sized. They have a single centrally located nuclei. They are going to be branching cells. That means that they will be interconnected with other cells. That branching adds to the stability of the heart wall, myocardium. These cells are going to be interconnected with intercalated discs. They are specialized areas which include desmosomes, which add to the structural strength of the cardiac wall, and very importantly, gap junctions, which are going to allow electrical current to travel from cell to cell because you want those cardiac muscle cells to act like a unit. These cells are going to contain a large number, relatively speaking, of mitochondria. And in fact, about 1/4 to 1/3 of total cell volume is going to be mitochondria. Only infrequently will you see or know that these cells will use anaerobic respiration during times of ischemia or times of hypoxia, and it really is only to preserve the tissue. Most of the cellular respiration of these cells will be cellular respiration, aerobic respiration. If you're going into anaerobic respiration, you have a problem, ischemia or hypoxia. So we remember there are striations in the cells. The actin and myosin in cardiac muscle cells is not as well organized as you'll see it in skeletal muscles, although they do believe that these cells are going to contract by the sliding filament theory because of the fact that there is actin and myosin that are arranged somewhat like what you see in skeletal muscle. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to be less developed and is going to store less calcium, and the intercellular space is going to be filled with loose connective tissue. That's going to be loose areolar connective tissue. Please remember, these cells are self-exciting, so it's self-exciting tissue. You're going to have rhythmic contractions, and they're going to be involuntary with all or nothing. Either the whole thing is going to contract or it will not contract. This should look familiar. There are the striations, there are the branching cells, there are the intercalated discs. Small cells, single nucleus. couple of videos, watch those. We already talked about this, but as a reminder, this is really important. They are unique junctions for cardiac muscle cells. Intercalated discs are major portals for the very important intercellular communication for cardiac muscles. They are required to coordinate the contraction and maintaining circulation of cardiac muscle cells. They're going to link cells together. They will help stabilize the cells. They define the borders. Intercalated discs are crucial for the health and well-being of cardiac muscle cells and the ability for the heart to act like a functional syncytium, which we'll talk more about in a minute. The conducting cells within the myocardium are about 1% of the myocardium. They're going to be very important because they will depolarize without neural or endocrine stimulation. They're going to communicate through those gap junctions in the intercalated disc, which we've already talked about. They will be stimulated by autorhythmic cells of the cardiac conduction system in order to produce and sustain contractions that will propel blood. Within the myocardium, there will be a network of connective tissue fibers. It's known as the cardiac skeleton. There are going to be 4 bands of connective tissue around the heart valves and the bases of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. They will separate the atria from the ventricles. They're going to be important because they form and anchor the valves. In addition, they reinforce the myocardium, and they will provide some electrical insulation in between various parts of the heart. They form a so-called firewall in between the atria and the ventricles when it comes to electrical activity. This is not something that I would post a diagram of on an assessment and pin or mark and say, identify this, but you need to understand the concept of this and the functions of what the cardiac skeleton does. Excuse me. The heart needs to act like a functional syncytium. So a syncytium means cells that work together. So it is defined as either a single cell or a cytoplasmic multinucleated mass, which acts as a unit. So why? It's going to be because of the fusion of cells or the division of the nuclei within the cells. The heart is going to be composed of multiple cells that act like a unit. They are a functional syncytium. Here's a diagram I mentioned. You can see the figure 8 of the cardiac muscles around the atria and around the ventricles. And that is going to be important because that allows each of the chambers to empty fully when we need to move blood from chamber to chamber and then out of the ventricles up into the great vessels. Let's talk a little bit about the endocardium. It is a layer of simple squamous epithelium, and deep to that will be loose areolar connective tissue. It is going to cover the inner surfaces of the heart, including the valves. We've already talked about the endothelium of this lining being continuous with the great vessels, and embryologically and structurally, it's going to be the same tissue as the endothelial lining of the vessels, and they will be continuous and continuous. Contiguous and continuous. You need to know why this is important and why this is significant. 2 reasons. And I'm hoping you can figure them out. And if you can't, we'll go over it in class. So remind me to tell you if you haven't figured it out. This shows you the layers of the heart. You can see the pericardium, the serous pericardium, the visceral pericardium. You can also see the myocardium and the endocardium. This is another image showing you the heart wall and the various layers of the pericardium.